Hey guys, and welcome to our next video, our next lesson. So this one is going to be a brief review of the American Civil War, which lasted from 1860 to 1865. And this review, it's not going to get into too many specifics about military battles and things like that. This is just going to be a general overview of the causes, the effects, the results, the people, and a few of the key battles, some of the key battles in this war. So let's get started. So let's start off first with a summary of all the effects of the war. And this photo, as you can see in the background, is one of the battlefield, and I believe this is from one of the battle. This is the battle at Gettysburg, and so you can see from this picture how devastating and gory this battle was, and it kind of gives you a sense of. You can see the bodies in the background, some, and then a few in the foreground of the photo, and it kind of gives you a sense of what it would have been like had you actually been there, right? So sometimes war is romanticized, and people have they think of movies like wars in the movies, and really war is it's not that glory. It doesn't have that much glory to it. It's pretty in your face, pretty gruesome, right? And this battle, as a result of this war, actually the Civil War, we had over 600,000 dead and missing people by the end of the war, and the higher percentage of the dead came from the Confederate side, the southern side. So they started with fewer men in their armies. So the fact that they lost a lot of men, almost as many men as the Union Army, that means that there was obviously a higher percentage of their soldiers who died or were injured. You had over 500,000 soldiers who were wounded, who lost limbs, and this isn't even counting soldiers who had psychological trauma, emotional trauma, PTSD. That's what we would consider it today, post traumatic stress disorder. You also had 4 million newly freed African Americans who had resided in slave states. They had once lived in slave states, and most of which were in the Confederacy, of course. And what were they going to do with their lives in their new freedom? This war had given them their freedom, so now it's like, well, what are they going to do with this new freedom? This war also strengthened the economic and political power of the northern states, the victorious northern states, and the United States government. And then on the other side, you had the Confederacy. It was devastated. Every aspect of life, uh, every aspect of life in the South, their economy, their government, their society, was destroyed. It was completely changed. And so, what were the causes of this war? Let's talk a little bit about that. So, number one, without a doubt, is slavery, right? Never believe anybody who tells you that slavery was not the driving force behind the Civil War. It absolutely was. This Civil War was absolutely about slavery. This argument about slavery had been going on since the United States existed, actually before the United States even existed, going all the way back to the first. Remember Bacon's Rebellion, when we were learning about that, when you saw a sharp increase in the number of slaves and in the American colonies, right? Back then, and it caused a lot of tension even back then. But since the founding of the United States, the arguments over slavery had continued and intensified. Remember the Three-Fifths Compromise, the one that we learned about, and it had come into existence. And as the nation grew in size and people, there was arguing about where slavery should be and should slavery even be allowed in the United States. And it became more heated and it became more violent. For example, you had examples like Bleeding Kansas, where there were arguments over whether Kansas was going to be a slave state or a free state, and people violently fought each other in the years leading up to the Civil War. Harper's Ferry, where John Brown, a famous white abolitionist, and several supporters, they tried to seize at Harper's Ferry a federal arsenal, so a location where they had weapons stored, The federal government had weapons stored in this arsenal, and John Brown and his supporters at Harper's Ferry, they tried to seize it, to take control of it, and they caused a slave uprising. And actually, even in Washington, D.C., on the floor of the Senate in the Capitol building, you had a Southern senator take his cane and physically beat another senator, a senator named Charles Sumner, who was an abolitionist, who was against slavery, and he beat him over the head on the floor of the Senate. So clearly, after talking about, Harper's Ferry, John Brown, and the slave uprising, and Charles Sumner getting beaten, clearly violence was everywhere. And out west, there was a lot of violence, and even in D.C., in the Capitol building. So, the government tried to pass compromises that would try to please slave states and the non-slave states. And they thought, these compromises would solve the problem. But we know they really only solved the problem for a little bit. But then the argument would begin again. So compromise only took us so far. And some of the well-known compromises were the Missouri Compromise from back in 1819, 1820. You had the Compromise of 1850, which came after the Mexican-American War. And then we had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And then you had a Supreme Court case that was critical to causing the Civil War. Dred Scott versus Sanford. This basically divided the nation because it basically said that no state and even Congress could outlaw slavery. Therefore, slavery could exist wherever any slave owner wanted to take their slaves. And this obviously angered a lot of people, a lot of abolitionists, a lot of people in states that didn't want slavery, right? You also had regional differences in the North. Like, for example, in the North, you had a lot of industry. You had large numbers of immigrants coming from Ireland, from Germany, from Western Europe. And in the West, you had folks coming from China, coming from Asia. Meanwhile, in the South, in the southern states, you had a much more wider, whiter population, right? They're more white, with fewer immigrants. And so the basis for labor were either poor white people or, as we all know, mostly slaves were the backbone of labor in the South. And their economy in the South was driven by slavery and by the plantation owners who made up a minority of the population. They basically controlled the local politics of the South because of their power, because of their wealth. So these wealthy Southern plantation owners really had control of Southern local politics. And so, like I said, they basically controlled the culture in the South. So then came the election of 1860. And this was a turning point. This election, we saw Abraham Lincoln win the election. He was the first Republican to be elected president. And the Republican Party at this time wasn't even 10 years old. They were a very new party. They were founded on the idea of ending the spread of slavery. And it's important to note that Abraham Lincoln, he won as a minority president. He only had 40% of the popular vote. Only 40% of voters had actually voted for him. So he was a minority president, and he was a Republican, which angered a lot of southern states. A lot of people in the South were upset because he wanted to limit the spread of slavery. And the southern politicians, obviously, they wanted, and slave states in general, they saw this as a threat to their way of life, to the end of slavery. And so before Lincoln was even sworn in as president, states began to secede, right? And the first state that seceded was South Carolina. It was the first state to secede since Lincoln was elected in November of 1860. South Carolina voted to secede, not succeed, but secede. Secede means to politically separate. So South Carolina voted to secede themselves from the United States in December So a month later. So this was months before Lincoln was even sworn in as president. He had just been elected, and he still needed to be sworn in. So before he was even sworn in, South Carolina had voted to secede, and South Carolina was soon joined by 10 other southern slaveholding states. And when you look at this map on the right, the states that are in light blue, they stayed with the Union. They stayed with the United States. Right? Whereas the states in the purple became Confederate states, as you can see here. So states like Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Florida, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, those purple states, they all became Confederate states. And you had states like Missouri, which is in blue here, Kentucky and Maryland. They stayed with the Union, but they were still slave states. And you'll notice right over here on the right, if you can see, Washington, D.C. is right here in blue. D.C., where D.C. is located, is right smack dab between Maryland, which was a border state and remained part of the Union. It was between Maryland and Virginia and West Virginia. And so Virginia, or D.C., was located right in between Maryland and Virginia. It was right in between North and South. And you can see to the west of Virginia, there's this blue right here. You have West Virginia came into existence during the Civil War because that was once part of Virginia. And, there weren't many slaves in this part of the state. And the whites who lived in that area, the occupants of this area in Virginia, didn't want to leave the Union. And so they actually voted to leave Virginia. And they formed their own state. And that's why we have the state of West Virginia to this day. Right? And so the Civil War fighting, it soon began in April of 1861 at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And after that, the war truly began. The first battle on the ground was in Virginia at the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, which is it's a short drive just outside of Washington, D.C. And speaking of notable battles, right, there were some other important ones. So you also had Antietam in 1862. And we know this is, even to this day, the bloodiest day in American history, with 4,000 soldiers killed and 23,000 casualties total. So that includes those killed and those wounded. And that was in a single day. And then you had Gettysburg in 1863. This is the bloodiest battle of the war that lasted several days. So it's not just a single day, it lasted several days. And it was the last serious attempt by the Confederate forces to invade the North. You also had Vicksburg, which concluded the same time as Gettysburg in 1863. This battle gave the Union Army control of the Mississippi River, which meant that the Confederacy was effectively split in half geographically. And then you had Atlanta in 1864. This was a critical city for the Confederacy. And when it was captured, it divided the Confederacy again and made it impossible for them to ship supplies to their armies around the different states in the Confederacy. And then finally, you had the Battle of Richmond in 1865. Richmond, Virginia, was the capital of the Confederacy, and it was finally captured by the Union Army in April of 1865. And then the largest Confederate army, the Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, surrendered shortly after Richmond was captured in 1865. And this surrender happened in Appomattox in 1865, just after Richmond was captured. So Appomattox was a small town in southwest Virginia, and that's where Robert E. Lee surrendered, and it was the last major battle of the war. So some notable people Some notable people in the Civil War you may have heard of, besides President Lincoln. You had Robert E. Lee. He was the top Confederate general. You may have heard his name because there's different universities and schools around the country. You had Washington and Lee University, for example. And Robert E. Lee, he was actually president of that university after the Civil War, and he was buried on that campus. And Robert E. Lee has also been in the news a lot because of statues around the United States. I'm sure you've heard in the news there's some statues of him around the United States, and a lot of people have been demanding that they be torn down. And some of them have been taken down in places like New Orleans, Louisiana. So there's a lot of controversy about Robert E. Lee. And then you had Ulysses S. Grant. He's this guy right here. He was the top Union general, and he would later be president of the United States. He led the Union Army that began, he kind of turned the tide and helped to win the war for the United States. And then we have Frederick Douglass. He pushed for the ending of slavery and helped to convince Abraham Lincoln to write the Emancipation Proclamation. And he also pushed for the recruitment of African American soldiers, including his two sons. And they played very active roles, very notable roles in the Civil War. And there was also two women who played important roles in the Civil War, and they were Clara Barton and Dorothy Dix. Dorothy Dix, who I mentioned in our previous our previous lesson. So Clara Barton and Dorothy Dix both were women nurses, and they helped to provide medical supplies to soldiers to the Union Army. And they also helped with locating and identifying dead soldiers. And Clara Barton, she played a critical role in doing that, in identifying dead soldiers. And her office was located in Washington, D.C., right? And so this is a picture of her. And so let's go back real quick. This is a picture of Robert E. Lee in his Confederate uniform. This is, again, Ulysses S. Grant in his Union uniform. You can tell with the stars on him, on his jacket. And here's, of course, is Frederick Douglass again and Clara Barton. And so, like I said, you can go downtown in Washington, D.C. I've seen this when I traveled there. You can see the office where she worked to help locate and identify dead soldiers after the war had ended, so that families would know where and what happened to their loved ones. So one of the most important events that did not happen on a battlefield was the Emancipation Proclamation. And this was issued in 1862 after the Union Army supposedly won the Battle of Antietam, even though it was so bloody. So this was issued after the Battle of Antietam in 1862, but it took effect on January 1st, 1863. And what it actually did was it freed all the slaves in the states that were in rebellion, all the Confederate states. It freed all the slaves there. It did not free slaves in states that were still part of the United States. States like Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Slavery still existed in those states. And one other, and in fact, a more critical thing that it did was it allowed for the enlistment of African Americans in the Union Army. This would mean that hundreds of thousands of African American men would be able to enlist in the Union Army and help turn the tide in their favor. However, they did have to form separate regiments. So they had to fight in their own separate groups, regiments. And the officers of these regiments were white. But nevertheless, African Americans, they had a major impact. They made up a total of about 10% of all the soldiers in the Union Army. And a good chunk of those soldiers, even though they were only 10% of the army, they had a much higher fatality rate than white soldiers. And this was for several reasons. First of all, many times they were put in very dangerous situations. So they were basically used as human fodder and shields, which is disgusting. And another reason is because they fought harder. They had felt that they had much more to fight for because they were fighting for their own freedom and to free those that they loved, right? So the end of the war came about in 1865, and Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surrendered at Appomattox, and soon after, Confederate forces surrendered um, there instead of going off into the hills and the mountains and fighting a guerrilla war, which they could have done, but they didn't do that. They surrendered. And Lincoln was soon assassinated, like a week, not even a week after Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Lincoln was assassinated right in Washington, D.C., at Ford's Theater on April 14th. And then he died in the morning of April 15th, right across the street in Peterson House in 1865. And you can go see this in Washington, D.C. I've been there. And there's actually the bed that they took him to after he was shot. You can see the bed that they laid him down in, and you can see a stain of blood from the president after he was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer who was upset that the North had won. So another important aspect of the end of the war was that it settled the question of the superiority of the federal government over state governments. Now, although it wasn't, there were still arguments about what rights the states had versus the national government, right? And there are still debates about this to this day. But for the time being, after the Civil War, it basically settled the question over who was dominant in national government, either the national government or the state government. Basically, it was settled that the national government was dominant. And it also settled the question of whether or not a state could secede from the United States. And obviously, after the war, the Civil War, it became apparent that is not allowed. State governments are not allowed to secede from the United States. And another big effect of the war was the Republican Party and Northern politicians would go on to dominate national politics for several decades following the Civil War. So basically, the Republican Party took control of the government, even in the reconstructed South, which we'll learn about. And in fact, the next president to come from a southern state in the South would be Woodrow Wilson, and that wouldn't be until 1912, right? So from 1860, when Lincoln was elected, there would not be a president coming from a southern state until 1912. So doing the math on that, that's 52 years later, almost. So a half a century later is finally when another southern president is elected. And that's a result of the Civil War. So the southern states, as I mentioned previously, they were physically, economically, politically, and spiritually crushed. Hundreds of thousands of their men had died. Their families were left distraught. Physically, the landscape had changed. The Union Army had marched through places like Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, and had burned down cities, had taken down trees, had taken supplies, burned down farms, right? And another thing was slaves were now free. So a lot of these people who had depended on slave labor, suddenly they had to find other ways to manage their farms and to run their farms. And the former slaves weren't happy. Some of the former slaves weren't happy to be free. They were happy to be free, but they weren't really sure what the future held for them, right? So they were glad to have their freedom, but they were kind of unsure. Okay, well, what's coming next after this? And they weren't sure what the future held. And they tried to find lost family members who had been sold away. Otherwise, like some of them had vanished. Others had headed north, and others really weren't sure what to do. They enjoyed their freedom, but they were going to think we're going to have a hard time trying to figure out what they could do. And they're going to find that their opportunities were limited by those whites who were still in power in the South. And this time period that there was going to follow the war, following the war, was Reconstruction. And we'll get into that more later, and we'll see that Reconstruction saw many advantages, saw many opportunities for African Americans and for the United States, but ultimately we'll see that we really fell short of what our goals were and what could have been at the end of Reconstruction. It could be said that we fought the war. There was a lot of hope for the future, a lot of opportunity that we could have provided and given to the newly freed African Americans. And you can see that there was an effort to do this, an effort to make things better, but we did ultimately fail. So we'll do a review. We'll go deeper into the Reconstruction. And so let me know if you have any questions on this lesson, and I hope I'll see you soon.